Morning. Thank you for that kind introduction, and it is really a privilege to be here. This is a great collaboration and a great forum about a really important topic. I always like to start with keeping our eye on the ball, our vision. What is it that we are trying to achieve? And at FDA, the Device Center has a vision that says patients in the U.S. have access to high quality, safe and effective medical devices of public health importance first in the world, and that marketed devices remain safe, effective, and high quality. We thought really carefully about all those words. Patience is the first word for obvious reasons. I think we all care about that, and the work you do and that we do really has an impact on patients. First in the world is really important. It doesn't do anyone any good if there's a great technology and it's not coming to patients. If we're delaying the technology 10 years and it turns out to be a good technology, we've wasted an opportunity to help a lot of people. And so the discussion we're having today, to me, is really about trying to leverage the information that's available, strike the right balance, figure out how we can evaluate technologies and get them to patients quickly and appropriately. I think we also have to recognize that healthcare delivery is very different than it was, and it continues to evolve and change. Procedures and patients that used to be treated in the hospital are now treated on an ambulatory basis, or they're treated at home. We get lots of data. There's wearables and digital health devices, much more information available about the patients living at home and living healthy than we've ever had before. We have new information regarding how diseases evolve and are treated outside the hospital. And we need to figure out how to use all this information and all this data. We also have, amazing electronic health record systems now and claims data, all these other avenues of data. And so again, very timely to be talking about how can we leverage this information so that we can make good decisions in a timely fashion. I found this statistic really a microcosm of the challenge that an individual person will generate over 1 million gigabytes of health data in their lifetime. And what a waste if we don't try to tap into that, if we don't figure out how to make use of all the information and all the data. It's hard. We need to develop new methodology. We need to think about how can we figure out what works and what doesn't work, but there is a treasure trove of information out there, and we need to tap into it if we're going to continue to expedite therapies to patients. And then, I've shown this slide for literally decades because it's really important for all of us to understand that devices are not drugs for a variety of reasons. Drugs, you can have a placebo mask trial to figure out whether the drug works or not. Once a drug is approved, it stays, the chemical formula doesn't change. It stays unaltered on the market for decades. A drug like Captopril, which was approved in 1981 by the FDA. It's a blood pressure pill and a heart failure pill. Is the exact same drug. You can go to the pharmacy and buy it today. It's the same pill. So over time, you learn a lot about drugs and what their side effects are and how they work. And devices are just very different. They iterate, they evolve. Think about the phone that you're using. 10 years ago, it was slower. It didn't have as much memory. It couldn't do as much. And they evolve very rapidly. And so if we take the same product evaluation models and apply it to devices that we apply to drugs, we're going to be delaying important therapies from getting to patients. And so it's really important to think about new ways or different ways of evaluating the data that's available. We're going to be talking today about, when is a clinical trial, or how can clinical trials be leveraged, and how can you leverage observational data or other types of data. Clinical trials have challenges. Many of you, I'm sure, are familiar with them. On paper, they sound great because it's a nice way to try to figure out whether there's a relationship between an intervention and what happens to the patient. But there are challenges in running clinical trials. They're costly, getting patients to follow up, the time associated with getting the answer associated with the clinical trial. And then you do this amazing clinical trial and you don't really know how that product is going to perform when you actually put it in the community, because the trial's done at academic centers, oftentimes with really outstanding researchers and clinicians and academic physicians and healthcare providers. But oftentimes when you roll a product or a therapy out to the community, you get different results. Or it might perform better. It might, the way that product is implanted might not be done as well or differently. And so the value of having real world evidence is that you really get to see how a therapy works when it's applied in clinical practice. And so being able to leverage the real world evidence and data is important. There's lots of sources. I've already alluded to some of them: electronic health records, claims data, registry data. There's national registries in the cardiovascular space and many others. And probably the biggest evolving area is the patient-generated health data, wearables, sensors, getting information from patients, just because they're walking around with a phone. And there are a lot of apps that are now on phones that are collecting health data. So figuring out how to tap into this. And we use two terms of art: real world data and real world evidence, where the real world data is the data related to the patient health status. And the real world evidence is the evidence regarding the usage, about the benefits and risks of a given product. At FDA, we embrace the use of real world data and evidence, as long as it's fit for purpose. There are, along the vertical lines, really any discipline. There's no magic to the cardiovascular space, although I think there is a lot of great available real world evidence in the cardiovascular space, but we use this type of data in neurologic space, in the orthopedic space, ophthalmology, et cetera. It also can be used to support pre-market evaluation, and it can be used to identify safety concerns or evaluate product performance in the post-market space. And it can be used in any type of regulatory setting in the pre-market space. We have names for the different pathways depending on the risk of the device across the top there. But the main point is that real world evidence can really be used in a lot of different ways in a lot of different places. And we've published guidance. So if you haven't seen it before, you can go read our guidance document that summarizes how we think about the use of real world evidence. We're actively involved in collaborating. FDA doesn't have all the data. Lots of different data holders, academic centers, healthcare centers and others have access to lots of really valuable, great data. And so we have been engaging with coordinated registry networks, with international registries, worldwide registries. We can often gain access or help communicate and collaborate with others around the world to facilitate evaluation of different products. I put this slide up because oftentimes when we think about real world evidence, there might be a clinical trial that was conducted, and I have this swim lane. There's an authorized indication for a given product, and I'll show a couple of examples in a minute. And oftentimes real world evidence can be used to get into a different swim lane, to evaluate evidence and expand the use into different patient populations or for different uses. And so this isn't an either or. Oftentimes clinical trials and the use of real world evidence can be used in a complementary way to help evaluate for patients across the spectrum. Here's one example. This is for a transcarotid stent. So the carotid arteries sit in the neck. If they get blocked, you get blood flow problems to the brain, and you can end up getting a stroke. And the conventional treatment was surgery. You make an incision, you open the artery, and you remove the plaque inside. It's invasive. It takes a long time to recover. It has risks of stroke and bleeding. And so companies develop stents where you can use a catheter and put a stent in and expand a stent and reopen the artery. And this company had received approval through a clinical trial for patients that were at high risk for complications from the surgery, the carotid endarterectomy. So that had already been established. And then we were able to use, or the company was able to use, available data, real world evidence, to expand the indication from high-risk patients, patients at a high risk for surgical complication, to what we called standard risk, a lower risk population of patients. And they did that by looking at data from the Vascular Quality Initiative. And what they did was used it through a pre-specified study, a propensity match design, where for every one patient who had been treated with the stent, they identified 3 patients via propensity score matching that had undergone surgery. And this was the comparison that was done. There was a lot of demographic information about the occlusion itself. And the results are down here on the left. But the bigger point is we ended up with a data set of over 11,000 patients. And the adverse events, the primary endpoint was 30-day death, stroke, and myocardial infarction, and 1 year stroke on the same side. So there was no difference in the performance of the stent versus the surgery. Numerically, the complication rates are a little bit higher, but we felt that this was an important therapy and option to be available. And this was again, a great example of how existing data or data in an existing registry could be used to expand the indication of a treatment. Here's another example, an inferior vena cava filter removal. Inferior vena cava is the main blood vessel in your abdomen. All the blood from your legs goes through it, and sometimes blood clots in the legs can travel to the lungs and cause a pulmonary embolism. And so filters can be placed to screen out or block the blood clot. And then the filters generally should be removed because over time they can develop problems or fractures, but they get scarred in place. And so this product, a laser sheath, had already been authorized for removing other types of devices, and they were able to demonstrate, and it had been used clinically to remove inferior vena cava, but there wasn't evidence that we were aware of to support it. And so they were able to conduct a retrospective analysis of real world data from electronic health records at a number of centers and from a single site. And again, they were able to show that the device major complication rate was low at an acceptable rate, and the overall effectiveness of removing the filter was over 95%. So again, not a clinical trial where there's a control group and you're comparing one group to another, or it's prospectively conducted, but we were able to use the available evidence to get comfortable that the device was performing effectively and safely. And then one final example on the post-market side, an intravascular lithotripsy system. This is for a product in the coronary vessels that uses lithotripsy during stent placement, but there were questions about the potential safety concerns related to use of the device, particularly in patients who might have other implanted cardiac devices. And so this study is leveraging patients from the National Cardiovascular Device Registry, and we'll be studying about 1,000 patients to look at whether those types of complications are occurring. So, just a potpourri of examples in the cardiovascular space for how real world evidence and data can be used to address important questions. It's not perfect, it's not always fit for purpose, but offers great opportunities. And if you're interested, we've published a compendium of a number of examples of real world evidence. This is available on our website. There are about 90 examples in this across all the different products and all different types of regulatory uses. I just thought I'd conclude by highlighting again the importance and evolution of the access to digital technology. And, it is clear that patients are going to be walking around and have so much data associated with their healthcare. A recent example is just diabetes care is totally revolutionized. Patients have all their, continuous glucose readings on their device, in their phone, being transmitted to their physician. We have much more health data than we've ever had before. So figuring out ways to tap into this data in a reasonable fashion to help develop products, bring products to patients, monitor the safety of products that are on the market is really important. And developing methodology that's widely accepted and used is really important as well, which is why the groups that are hosting this meeting today are so important. Finally, I just thought I'd conclude by highlighting the real value that real world evidence and data can bring to the health equity challenge that we all face. It's really important that products be evaluated for everyone and not just some people. It's one of our strategic priorities, and I know it's a priority of many companies and many healthcare institutions. So the access to real world evidence is really a game changer because it allows us to evaluate the performance of products in a much larger population, a much more diverse population. It allows us to get access to data in people who may be remote and not able to interact or contact the healthcare facilities. And so this is a really important aspect of why this topic is important. So I'll conclude there, but just reiterate what I said at the outset, which is it's just really a true pleasure to be here. Really appreciate the gathering and bringing this group of people together to have this really important discussion. So thanks for the invitation.
When like a clinician uses the device, your microphone if it works. When a clinician uses a device outside of indication, usually probably has a pretty strong sense that this patient will benefit from it. And I'm concerned that a simple comparison of people who got the device outside of indication versus standard therapy, it's looking out folks who actually have a liver cirrhosis. And as a suggestion to address that concern is that even after approval, there's only to see whether the relative benefit is maintained. Once you don't have to juggle that a psychological burden in order to use the device.
Yeah, you're raising really important points that apply to virtually every evaluation of real world evidence. The inherent bias that can occur in decisions that are made in healthcare. And it's why coming up with methodologies to minimize the bias is so important. There are ways that, if patient selection is a particular concern, sometimes you can try to find a group of patients that didn't get the therapy that otherwise seem to be alike and what happened to them. But your larger point is a really important one. Understanding who the patients are that are being treated and what the outcomes are is important. Sometimes you're trying to figure out cause and effect, and you might need a control group so that you can understand what happened or what would have happened had they not gotten treated. I think, in an example like the IVC filter, that's a place where being able to say, the filter could be successfully removed and here are the complication rates, and that those outcomes were acceptable is a little bit different, I think, than saying an intervention makes a patient better.
Dr. Maisel, as we think about the health equity issues related to real world evidence, how do these large data sets mean that we do now have data on more diverse patients? In cardiovascular medicine generally, there's this new rural-urban divide, and a lot of the centers that contribute data tend to be large academic centers with urban catchment areas. How is the FDA thinking about evaluation in rural populations?
Yeah, so again, a great question. I do think having more data on a more diverse patient population helps, but it doesn't address, all the questions. There's inherent bias in how we treat people potentially because of their race or ethnicity. And so just because you have the data doesn't mean that it answers all of our questions. Remote care, home care is evolving, whether it's rural or whether it's a few miles from here in a inner city that doesn't have access to healthcare. Getting access, we don't know what we don't know. So getting access to that data and arming those people and getting their data is important. What we end up doing as far as, mandating data collection for authorization or approval, I think is still evolving.
Bob Harrington from Stanford. Bill, that was fabulous. What's the level of conversation that goes on between FDA and CMS on the evidence on coverage proceedings? It seems to me that you've had some great examples. Cardiovascular was one, lung reduction surgery was another one where CMS actually only covered the procedure if it was considered to be part of a research study. Do you actively engage CMS in those conversations about things you'd like to see exposed through more rigorous evaluation, either prior to market approval or after market approval?
Yeah, I mean, we have interactions with them. Our mandates and missions are separate and distinct. They're reasonable and necessary for the Medicare population, where safety and effectiveness. But we certainly recognize that a company that is setting off to evaluate a product is better off knowing what it's going to take to get to the reimbursement finish line and not just necessarily the FDA finish line. And those aren't always exactly the same. So we try to encourage the payers to have a seat at the table. We've formed a payer collaboration community where companies can request that payers come in early, not just CMS, but others, so that they can at least know what's going to be expected in order to reach reimbursement. And quite frankly, we've envisioned, an infrastructure where there's data collection, where everyone has access to it, whether if it's the NCDR and there's, cardiovascular registries, those can be, potentially linked to claims data and everyone wins. The companies win because it's easier to evaluate their product. Patients win and because the products are getting evaluated more. CMS wins because they're getting the data they need. So part of what you've seen in the collaborations we're trying to establish is that really that infrastructure creates a data superhighway for everyone to leverage. But we do try to encourage the payers to come in early. It's hard. They're not as, they don't have as big a staff as we do at FDA. So it's hard for them to have a seat at the table as often, but they're trying.
Friends of the FDA Division of Cardiovascular Devices, Dr. Hamilton raises a key question. Another sticking point is that with the FDA Breakthrough Devices Program, the endpoints that might be utilized for FDA Center for Devices might be somewhat different than what CMS is looking for coverage. So two things that we recommend from a practical basis. Number one, for an important new cardiovascular device, it's absolutely essential to have some contact with CMS and the FDA up front, and we can help facilitate that. The second thing is that we have started moving into the world of seamless clinical trial development, where medical devices can be evaluated in a clear, prospective, stepwise fashion, where after a certain amount of data, the FDA can make an initial approval decision while the trial is ongoing for further data or CMS or other insurance purposes. This is the paradigm that's being used in heart failure and many structural heart valve device cases. So the world has changed.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.